discussion if we can see one another on video. If you need to mute your video, completely understandable. But if you are able to keep it on, that would be great too. And then I also want to bring greetings from AJ. She is attending a dissertation defense this morning. She might be able to join us a little bit later on in the session. And if she does, she will come on at the end and share some remarks and thoughts with you. But I wanted to be sure to share her greetings with you and share what she was up to this morning. So with that, I think we have a really terrific program for you today. We're so glad you're here, and I'm going to pass it on to Mary to get us started.
Good morning, friends. So good to see you virtually once again. I sure hope that you're all doing well. I often think about you all and what you're doing, and so I want to extend my thank you to each and every one of you for your hard work and all that you're doing for your students and also for your faculty and staff in this very unusual time. So please accept my thanks to all of you for just being the great people that you are. And oftentimes I remember being a college president and very rarely did you get a thank you. So from a retired president to someone who really appreciates what you're doing, my kudos 1000%. So as Kim mentioned, we're going to have a conversation today, and this is really a result of our September meeting. And in our September meeting, through the evaluation, we heard a number of comments from the presidents in the evaluation about continuing to have a conversation around equity in leadership and presidential leadership. We also submitted or asked you to submit any questions that you might have around this subject, and that we could possibly do a Q&A with the presidents in North Carolina and also with a guest. And it was kind of interesting because certain themes emerged as a result of the evaluation and also the questions. And the themes that the presidents had wanting to have further information were around 4 particular areas. One was around campus culture. Second was about the messaging, equity message. Third was about hiring and employees in general, and the fourth was institutional initiatives. So with those in mind, we developed a series of questions, those that came from the presidents and also from a conversation with some of our panelists. And we're going to have a 2-part presentation for you today. First, to address one of the interests of the presidents was to have a presidential speaker. And I believe you all had an opportunity to meet Dr. Charlene Dukes in September, President Emerita of Prince George's Community College, but also well known nationally for her work around equity and also her leadership throughout the country. Particularly, you may have recalled that she was the chairperson president of the AACC board. I've known Charlene for years, and I can tell you one thing: she's straight up and is honest, and she can give you the skivvies pretty much on anything. And I love her to death. And I know that she has embraced our North Carolina and is really willing to share her thoughts and perceptions on issues. Second part of our presentation will be a presidential panel. And again, this is a response to your inquiry and interest, and that is to have presidents across North Carolina give their perspective on this equity issue. We chose a series of presidents that included both rural and also maybe some presidents you know and love just as I do, but also that may have a different kind of composition than your campus. But it's how they're presenting this conversation of equity on their campus and how they can share it with you. And I think you're going to find the panel to be quite I would say enriching, and will give you I think some perspectives on these issues as we go forward. So with that being said, the first part of our presentation today will be Dr. Dukes, and she is going to speak to you for a bit of time on the subject of equity across the college. And so with that, Dr. Dukes, have you start.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Rittling, you know that we actually have an affinity for each other, and I will let you all know one of those reasons for my love for North Carolina is that my mother was actually born and raised in Charlotte. And that is where all of her family continues to live to this day. And once she determines that she might want to move back to Charlotte, it is likely that I will make it my home too. But today, what I wanted to do was give you a scenario around equity across the college. So just sit back and consider yourself to be part of the administration, faculty, and staff at America Community College. So good morning, and thank you all for your virtual presence today. As we have done regularly over the past year, we're here to inform and celebrate yet another milestone in our 3-year strategic plan. We made a commitment to lean into our goals and objectives, to understand our gaps and opportunities, and to celebrate our successes. Our strategic plan, Envision and Live Our Success, was developed with significant input from members of our college community. More than 100 faculty, staff, administrators, and students volunteered over the course of a year to develop the plan under the leadership of the Dean of Planning and the Vice President for Academic Affairs. They presented it for approval to the college community and ultimately to the Board of Trustees. They too are on this virtual update, and we continue to applaud that committee for work well done. Now, the Strategic Planning Committee partnered with community organizations, business and industry, local government, the local school system, and representation from the Board of Trustees. I will recap. The plan was developed with 3 key pillars: student success, regional connections, and organizational excellence. And as I shared in the previous updates, the co-chairs and members of the Strategic Planning Committee relied on key internal offices to provide student, employee, local, and regional data. They used economic impact studies and sought out other external data, all in the effort to reach directional consensus for our plan as we contemplated the future of America Community College. The committee presented a plan for consideration to you, to the cabinet, and then ultimately to the Board of Trustees for review and approval. Refinements were made each step of the way to ensure that your voices were heard and represented. The goal of student success allowed us to develop action plans to foster greater enrollments in key high wage or high need programs. Higher persistence, retention, graduation, and transfer rates were also noted as critical as well. To date, we have met every metric that was designed to increase and met everyone that was designed to decrease. We had a laser-like focus on equity and the outcomes for historically underrepresented or underserved and low-income students. I was proud to share 2 months ago and repeat again this month that we are on track to meet our goals of student success. Congratulations to all of you for leaning in and making this one of our top 3 priorities. This morning, however, I want to share the continuing focus on one of the key strategies associated with organizational excellence. And that is the college's desire, our desire, to live fully in our values of diversity, respect, success, professionalism, excellence, and lifelong learning. As we looked at employee data with a specific focus on demographics, it became absolutely clear that our student body is changing demographically rather rapidly, and our workforce is not keeping pace. It became almost painfully clear that our students recognized something that we did not. As we engaged in our monthly meetings with students, they began to talk about the lack of racial diversity in the classroom and in the offices committed to serving them. Their concern was not tied to an excellence or a lack of excellent service. Even as they shared their perspectives, they were quick to praise faculty, staff, and administrators for their clear and obvious commitment to students. The concern was tied to something just a lot more meaningful for them, and it should be for us. They were concerned about their own inability to see themselves as successful, to see themselves as potential contributors to our work at America Community College. Why was that? It was because they did not see anyone who looked like them in key decision-making positions in the classroom, in offices, and even in our boardroom. This recognition led to the formation of our objective to increase diversity in our workforce and on our board of trustees as the opportunities continue to present themselves in partnership with human resources and undergirded by a series of recommendations from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. With overwhelming support from the Board of Trustees and from me, the committee immersed itself in data gathering and held internal forums to hear from you. There were significant reviews of position descriptions. We wanted to understand if, albeit unintentionally, we were in our own language discouraging applications from people of color. We looked at our interview protocols to determine if the process could use an influx of best and promising HR practices in the 21st century. We engaged with local community leaders to solicit their direct, candid, and honest feedback and their assistance. And here's what we learned. America Community College was not community friendly, even as students chose to attend because we were the least expensive option. We did not appear particularly welcoming to hire people of color because our website and social media pages did not reflect people of color in employment, even as we showcase students. During the interview process, some candidates were quickly told they did not meet the qualifications, and the committee was baffled as to how they made it so far. Even though after review, the candidates did meet the minimum requirements and even went far beyond them. Members of the search committee were quick to share that a candidate might not be comfortable in the department because, after all, they had their own way of doing things. An urban myth was repeatedly shared about the one employee of color terminated 20 years prior due to an accounting error, almost costing the college a qualified opinion in the annual audit. The origin of the myth itself was interesting because in our HR records, we could not find that an employee of color had ever worked in the accounting department. And we did find an overwhelming dearth of employees of color in administrative, faculty, and professional positions, and an equally overwhelming representation in the lowest paid positions, primarily facilities and housekeeping. And based on those findings, following are the recommendations that I would like to share with you today from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The first is to require training for all search committees on conscious and unconscious bias in the hiring process, and use, where possible, real life experiences. To debunk the myths that move in and out of our college by creating a hiring task force to review the process, including position descriptions with input from hiring managers and the cabinet. To redesign the onboarding expectations to include assigning an experienced mentor to new employees. To revamp our hiring materials and hold hiring fairs in the community with a special emphasis on communities of color. To partner with the local HBCU, Historically Black College and University, and other four-year colleges and universities to create opportunities for master students to teach as adjunct faculty while they are pursuing their degrees. To create a community council to provide insight and perspective on the recommendations and serve as ambassadors for the college for the college and the communities where they live and serve. And one of the most critical things that I'd like to report to you today is that the Faculty Senate, as they've read and discussed the Inside Higher Education series on the Black experience in higher education, committed to redesigning the promotion and tenure processes to include service to students as one of the key components. Why? Because so many times, as the Senate discovered, our faculty of color are called on and expected to support students in ways that are beyond and in addition to the expectations of other faculty. And the Board of Trustees created their own subcommittee to address the lack of diverse representation within their midst. All of these recommendations have been accepted and assigned to key cabinet members for oversight and progress. The timeline has been set to complete this preliminary work within a minimum of 30 days to a maximum of 6 months. The journey to this point was not without its challenges. We had to actually peel back the onion at America Community College and expose our own behaviors, our own biases, and our own desires to do better by our students and better by the community we serve. We will be a better America Community College because of it. So this is the first step. It's an important one, and it's one that I am so proud that I was able to support because it came from the more than 100 faculty, administrators, staff, and students who served on the Strategic Planning Committee. So I want to thank you for being here today, and I am open for any questions that you might have. So let's talk about the reason for that. And maybe what we can do is start by having some of you, and Kim or Mary, I should say, however you want to handle it, if people will raise their hands and indicate what they heard and what was important to each of you as you think about equity in the classroom with students, but also in terms of how we look demographically as institutions of higher education.
So who would like to start and comment on Dr. Duke's presentation as the president of the university or the college?
And feel free to use the chat feature as well if you would like to ask your questions there.
And so the real question is, could you do this at your institution? What kind of support would you get? What kind of feedback might you expect? And what are the communication loops that you would have put in place for those who may not want to speak openly in public, but want to be able to give you some feedback on what's happening at America Community College, why it is or maybe is not so important to think about diversity in the workplace?
I think it's an easier conversation to talk about things we can do to improve student equity outcomes. I think that's a space we're relatively comfortable with. I think we move into a space of great discomfort when we start looking at our organizations and thinking about how we ourselves contribute to this issue. This is a far more challenging thing to address. But we can't get to the student equity issues unless we look at the organizational issues. The way we're trying to approach it is by doing a salary and equity study and then having some outsiders come in and give us some insights that about our organizational structure, and moving from there, because there's also not as much data, right? How many, other than looking at the racial makeup of your various classifications within your organizations, what other data do you use to say your organization is or is not structured properly? And that's the other piece of the pushback I think that you'll get. So yeah, I think we can do this. I just think this part of it is far more difficult. So.
I would add, this is Tim Brewer, I would add to that comment, has to be a very, very intentional process. And what I heard from Dr. Dukes is it was very intentionally and significantly vetted into the strategic plan. But you cannot be intentional until you've done some fundamental things on campus to prepare yourself, but also your faculty and staff to go down this road. So the intentionality has to be there, but before you have intentionality, you have to have some significant commitment campus-wide among your faculty and staff, and that takes a lot of work.
I especially appreciated Dr. Duke's remarks and plan. I would add one feature, the environment in which your college exists, the culture of your community has to be addressed as well. I live in a community that is an extremely conservative county, and relatively few Black residents, because the county was founded by Quakers who did not own slaves, and historically there was not our numbers are probably half of what the typical average Black population is for our county, but racial attitudes in the county that I live in, we're doing wonderful things for diversity and equity and inclusion on our campus, but we can't be an island in a community that lacks diversity and equity and inclusion. If you go to a Chamber of Commerce annual dinner with 400 people and see 4 Black people in the room, and if it's that kind of community, what I'm getting at is that our efforts have to reach beyond our college to also take on as part of our mission to create diversity, equity, and inclusion in the community and to re-educate them. And of course, it takes a long time to change culture. We had our annual Chamber of Commerce retreat this past week. The whole theme was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for that to be a theme in this county for a Chamber of Commerce retreat, and it was well done and had a powerful impact. But I'm just saying that community colleges are deeply rooted in the community, and for us to take hold in the community, you also have to make an attempt to stand up to these values in the community. And so I think culture is a huge part of this, and we can't just be satisfied for us to change our hiring practices. That's a big part, but we have to make an impact in our community as well.
Thank you for that. The other thing that you just mentioned about the chamber having this, program and this focus says that how can you even think about that as a potential supporter for the work that you're doing, and how important are their voices in the community that could also support the voice of the college with regard to this issue.
I will say that one thing that I really liked about what you said was the alignment, to get some traction and movement. One thing I've really had to be aware of is big decisions, making sure that they are consistent and bringing that theme out. I live in a very different area. I live in the county where our main campus is, and where I reside is majority Black. But they're not the people who in our community have the power. And I have a very diverse board. I have a very diverse leadership team. I have diverse, but not all pockets. And that's the other thing. You can still improve.
you know, the types of jobs we have here are in manufacturing, they're in logistics. And the question I had was, what do our teachers look like in those areas? Because community college, engineering, tech type jobs, manufacturing, they're white teachers and they don't look like other people. So we can always improve, and sending that message is really important. But being aligned, we had a charter school that was going to come into our area that was going to take a growingly defunct private school that had been created during the 60s as an express issue for segregation. And they wanted to work with us. And I had a judgment call to make, a very public judgment call to make. And I lost a donor over it. And I had to be okay with that. And I had to have my board be okay with that too. But sometimes you just have to stand up and say, if you become a charter school, we will work with you just like we work with any other charter school. But we are not going to help you become a charter school because that's going to hurt our current partners. And it is opposite of our equity work that we are doing. And those are hard things to have to say, but they're important things to have to say.
So I think the other question is, and how do you talk to your board about that? Because in many instances, you know, as presidents, we stand out there sometimes in what looks like a lonely position. And we may have board members who don't always agree with the position. So how do you have those conversations and that dialogue ahead of time to ensure, to the extent possible, one of two things: that the board and the president are on the same page and at least have the same beliefs, even if you think differently about how you approach it, or that there is enough support and voice on the board, even if there is a single or maybe more naysayers.
I think one of the things I learned from your presentation was the fact that when you take a look at where we are, and I agree, you got to be very intentional. You've got to look at the culture. You've got to look at equity and equality throughout the prospect to include the community. But I think also that when you get to a point where you think you're successful, that's a point to start, that you're never finished. And quite frankly, in our community, we're different than the ones that Bob talked about, because we're always moving. We're a Moby-centric community, and we're always shifting and shaping with the characteristic of our particular community. So about the time you think you've got everything fixed up, you find that it's not. And so it's a constant attention to the detail, a constant attention to making sure that people are in the classroom, administrative positions, and other places throughout the campus that gives equal representation and equity to the process. I think one of my frustrations sometimes is that while we know that underrepresented and those that are having difficulty, you know, we do everything in the world that we can to, at least in my estimation, to make those appeals. And we have success in getting some of them here, but the question is, what do you do to keep them here? And so I liked what you said about assigning, and we do this, but we assign people, but the question is, with those mentor relationships, have we assigned them and given enough, you know, empowerment to let them do the things that they need to do? And at the same time, maintaining the rigor and the relevance of what we do as educators, and providing basically a guarantee of a person's quality when he or she navigates the process and graduates and goes on to either further education or to the workplace. So when about the time you think it's finished, it's not finished. I mean, that should be the time that you say, okay, I'm going to recommit myself to this process and move forward.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to add, this is Tony Clark from Guilford Technical Community College. We're a majority minority school. When you add our Black population and Hispanic population together, we have two major cities. And from my perspective, when I came in, I mean, diversity of the workforce was on the strategic plan from the board. but there were no measures around it and no sort of, well, there weren't any measures around any of the strategic plan. But the idea was, the first thing I think in my experience is leadership has to state that it's important. So, you know, to say that we want to get more diverse, I mean, the president, in my mind, has to state it and has to be very clear that that is a goal. And then I think to Dr. Senegal's point, I mean, there's measures that you can have at the end of the process, say, you know, what does a workforce look like? But what we're going to also be working on are what are those in-process measures? So what does your hiring pool look like? Is that diverse? Because if your hiring pool is diverse, then you're more apt to get a diverse candidate at the end. Where do you spend your advertising dollars? Are you going to diverse publications? So what are those in-process measures that will hopefully end up impacting the final measure, which is the diversity of the workforce? So we're looking at things around the hiring pool, advertising. We're also looking at, there was some in AACC that pointed to a college in California about, they have a faculty mentoring program for minority faculty and how we can institute things like that. So we're really at the start. I shouldn't say a start because I'm sure we've been doing it for a while. The results have not been there as great as we would want. So, but as a new president, you know, we're sort of a start point of looking at these things. But I just want to add that idea about in-process measures instead of just looking at the end measure. What are those things you can look at as the process goes along to sort of increase your chances of success at the end?
Absolutely. You know, I also thought it was just important to include in there the fact that students are they are much more aware than we give them credit for. And that it is important to students of color to see people who look like them, who are making key decisions, who are in key places, because that sends a signal that I too can aspire to be in that similar kind of place. And even as we think about employees who are already on our campus and we think about promotions, whether they're administrative promotions, professional staff promotions, do we ensure that there's a level playing field and that everyone is treated equally in that process? I recall one day I was walking across the campus and a male employee stopped me. And what he said to me was, Dr. Dukes, you know, the cabinet has really changed. And this is when I first became president, and he was absolutely correct. The cabinet had changed in color and complexion, and there were no African-American men on the cabinet at that time. And what he said to me was, I don't know if I see myself here, if I see the opportunities for a career trajectory that will take me to a senior level position or the like. And I had to step back and really think about that. It wasn't intentional at all. But what it said to me is that even as we're making these decisions, that the people who work for us are looking and watching and developing their own perspectives or opinions about those decisions and how they impact them as folks who contribute to our work. So I threw that in there because I've heard it on any number of occasions that when we don't have employees who look like our students in every capacity across the board, then we are unintentionally sending messages to them that I know that as presidents of community college that we're not intending to do. But it is the perception and opinion that they take away with them every day. So I appreciate the opportunity just to give you that scenario, because like I said, the journey around these things will not be easy, but given those of you who commented, it tells me that you've been thinking about this and that you're saying, how can we work together to develop a plan of action, to communicate, to engage with our board, and to determine what the appropriate steps are, and then the measures that are in place. So all along the way, we're looking at metrics and our progress, and we're sharing that information. And we're also including the opportunity for people to provide a voice in the work that we're doing. So it was a quick scenario, maybe very different from what you expected, but just a way to get us to continue to think about equity beyond our student population and certainly inclusive of our student population and the communities where we serve. So with that, Mary, I'm going to
Yep.
turn it back to you, and
Sure.
we'll get to our next part of the morning.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you for that insight. And I'm sure that I heard a little bit in that American Community College scenario, a little bit about Prince George's, knowing your institution and the work you did there. Particularly from my perspective, what I found enriching from your conversation was, one, is that you grounded the information in true fact and what you learned. And secondly, that you took action as a president and you established a timeline when you were going to see the outcome. And you also gave a sense of urgency in that message, that this was not a time that we could just talk about it. We really had to do something about it. So I really appreciated that, and I am sure others have as well. So we're going to move on to our second part of our agenda today, and that is a presidential panel. And on the panel today is Dr. Tim Brewer, president of Mitchell Community College, Mark Porch, president of Caldwell Community College, Technical College, and also Thomas Walker, president of Wayne Community College. And the questions I'm going to ask these presidents, as well as Charlene, are related to the questions you submitted or the comments you made on the evaluation from our last equity workshop. And they are centered around 4 themes, as I mentioned earlier. And so let's delve into the first theme, and that is campus culture. And Charlene obviously gave us some grounding in this, but we're going to hear from the presidents now from their perspective. And this was a question that was presented in the evaluation. And I'm going to give this one to Mark. Mark, how have you led a holistic approach to achieve a culture of equity? And how have you been working toward a culture of equity with your executive team?
Well, thank you, Mary, and good morning to everybody and to my colleagues. Before I answer the question, I do want to take an opportunity just to say thank you to the Belk team for providing this venue for us to continue to learn from each other. I think it's very helpful. I've already learned so much from Dr. Dukes. We could end now, and I would be satisfied, Mary. But it's good to see all of you this morning. I also was joking with my friend and colleague, Dr. Brewer, earlier, and telling him that we had 2 middle-aged white guys on this panel talking about equity, and I'm not sure how much I can contribute, but I do think we're doing some good work at our institution, thanks to our faculty and staff, and we're kind of just beginning to dip our toe into the waters of equity, but it's already starting to pay off. One of the things that I would tell you, first of all, just to give you a little bit of a context, is our student body has significantly changed since I first came to Caldwell back in 2006. When I first came here, our Hispanic population was barely over 1%. It was 1.2%. Today, that number is over 9%. Our white population back in 2006 was 79%, and today, was 90%, and today it's 79%. So a significant shift in our student demographic. Our African-American population has kind of stayed steady around 4.5% over the course of that time. And so the issue of equity is certainly becoming increasingly important for our institution. So our approach in terms of building a holistic approach to equity started with essentially with what Dr. Dukes was just talking about earlier, and that is it's embedded in our strategic plan. We just completed and published our strategic plan for 2020 through 25, and we were kind of in the latter stages of that process back in March when we first had the President's Symposium right before COVID. And it was at that symposium that we really took a deeper dive into some of our data, got really granular, and began to look at different subsets of students and different demographic success metrics and things of that nature. And it was very clear that we had some significant equity gaps that we needed to address. And so now the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion are embedded throughout our strategic plan. In fact, I would say you can't look very far in that plan without finding nuggets of equity and inclusion and diversity on every page. It's embedded in our marketing and in our outreach plans. It's embedded in our enrollment and in our recruitment strategies, in teaching and learning, in retention, completion, engagement and activities for students, our hiring practice, culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've also, one of the things that I think is very significant in our strategic plan is our core values. And what we did with that process, we now have added a very distinct core value for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Previously, it was just kind of intermingled into the other core values, and now it's very, very distinct and very separate. Just this week, our marketing team is working on our core values and distributing posters across campus, posting those in visible places, and also sending that information to all of our employees. And I met with our employees virtually a couple of weeks ago and shared with them information about our equity and inclusion efforts. And in that, we talked about our core values. And I told them, I encouraged all of them to, once we had the core values distributed, for them to display those and have those accessible in their offices and refer to them every day. And I do that. I've got a printed copy out on my desk. I look at it every morning when I come in, and I ask myself, you know, is my work today going to contribute to the core values of the institution? And I ask them to do the same thing. And so hopefully they will do that, and they'll continue to carry out our very important work around this topic. As we developed our strategic plan, of course, all of our faculty, our students, our board, our community, various stakeholders were involved in that process. And I think part of Mary's question was, how's our executive team kind of carrying out this work? And just this morning in our what we call planning council, which is where we do all of our planning and assessment type activities, we talked about our equity work and really looking at various success metrics as we go forward. We're going to analyze all of our data. And again, I think we have to get very granular. You know, I think we have to look at not only in our classroom, but also in our support areas, and what impacts are we having for all of our students. You know, we have all of us have lots of different success initiatives, but are they working? And I think that's where we are, is really taking a deeper dive into some of our initiatives and determining, are they working? Are they not working? If they are, let's keep doing it. If not, let's tweak it and let's do something different to try to help all of our students be successful.
Thanks, Mark. So Tim, this is a question that came forward, and it had to do with the presidents themselves and their own professional development. So what have you done in your own professional development in understanding what is an equity-minded leadership, or what does a president who's equity-minded look like? And how do you embrace this in your leadership for your campus?
Thank you for the question, and good to see you all, and I'm flattered to be on this panel. I will tell you that the college has always had, at least in my time here, almost 15 years at this institution, there's always been an inclusion and diversity effort. Diversity task force is what it was called early on. In 2014, I came before our faculty and staff in an assembly and said, you know, if we're going to be a great institution, we've got to embrace our diversity. And that was the term we used at that point, just diversity. And that means that we've got to embrace each other and model that to our students. So using that as a jump off point, we did had some outside consultants come in and work with us in a group of about 40 people. And we really dug into what ended up being more, certainly diversity, but also equity and inclusion. And today now we have what's called our Equity Inclusion Council. But what that process did for myself, and I think for those that were involved, provided opportunities to learn more about what it is we mean by diversity. How do we embrace each other for who we are, and how do we work together, knowing that everybody has strengths to bring to the table. And what I found professionally is through those opportunities with that group that did the outside consulting, I grew personally, but also professionally, but also personally, in that I learned a lot about myself, and I did that in a way that in a larger group, and we got to the point, a very positive point, where we were talking about things that we would never dream we would have talked about in open sessions and so forth. And I'm talking about white privilege, conscious and unconscious biases, and so forth. And since that initiative, it's been in our strategic plan. Our board members participated in some of that training and have been on board with that. And we're at a point now where we're redoing that portion of our strategic plan, and really are the tipping point and moving to a different level of, a lot of training internally to how do we reach out through our hiring practices, has been mentioned, and also in the classroom, and recognizing diversity, not only in who the people are, but how people learn and those types of things. So as far as professional development, it began with that in-house process and continues on today. I think the community has recognized that we're doing these initiatives and doing these things, so we've been invited to be a part of that. And by all means, many colleges are much further ahead than we are, but this has been our experiences, is that once I kind of made the commitment, did make the commitment to stick with this. Our board made the commitment, and this large committee made the commitment. It has become more and more embedded into our culture. And this work is never done. This is ongoing. And what I found in a lot of these processes that may be helpful to others is I became, if you will, comfortable with being uncomfortable about talking about some things that were pretty raw. And I think that was very important. As uncomfortable it was, we began to become comfortable with that. And I think that's a key point for an institution. Are we all on the same page? Absolutely not. Do we still have things that are going on that we need to address? Absolutely. But we have reached the point where it is known that it is in our strategic plan, and we are able to have open conversations and dialogue. And that's kind of how it happened with us. And we're a work in progress. We're continuing to train. As I mentioned, we're continuing to look at our strategic plan and create more meaningful things in that. But that was how the process for me began. And I do believe that our culture is changing because of that, and the emphasis we've placed on it with a lot of training and a lot of clarity for me on how important it is for the institution. But I think the most important piece with that is the willingness to do it and stick with it. And quite frankly, oftentimes, and still today, we're not sure where we're going, but we know we need to go anyway. And that's kind of where we are, quite frankly. But it seems to be working and working well.
Thomas, I'm going to ask you to respond and share with us what's happening at Wayne from a holistic approach to the culture of equity and some of the professional development happening on your campus.
Well, good morning, Mary, and to everyone else. I count myself as one of the most fortunate, maybe not the most capable presidents, but I've always been places prior to my arrival here that were willing to invest in my development. And I would probably say that certainly at the top of the list, it has really sharpened my views and thoughts around this topic of equity was the Aspen Institute, of which I was in the first cohort. But I also, when I see Dr. Dukes, she and I are connected in a way in terms of a President's Roundtable group called the Lakin Institute, which has been responsible for as many Black community college presidents as any single organization. Was an experience that I had back in 2012. But I've also been to 2 different Harvard Institutes. I was a fellow at the National Center for Education Statistics at a time when equity was becoming an important issue. And I would say my baseline was actually many, many years ago at the basic school in the Marine Corps, where one thing I noticed about the Marines was they were unflinchingly unbiased in how they handed out misery. But they were also unflinchingly unbiased in looking at results. I think over time, what that helped me to do, Mary, was become comfortable with who I was and confident in who I was as a president. So my arrival here, I had also the advantage that I'd grown up about an hour and a half from Wayne. I knew the culture, grew up in that culture. So I came with a bit of trust, and it's not common for presidents to come from outside the state, as you're well aware, in North Carolina. But I think there were questions about that I didn't have to respond to in terms of would I be able to adapt to the environment. And my concern was more about could the environment adapt to me. So I've been very fortunate in my relationship with the board. I think they had a strong feelings around diversity and equity. And if you look at how our board has changed over the last few years, the commitment is shown there. And the campus has bought in primarily because first, I tried to keep it simple. It wasn't a broken campus when I got here. We had not put emphasis on diversity and equity, but there were some good things here. And if I could galvanize the faculty around success, student success, and we've got some very specific metrics across the 7 performance indicators that the state uses that we aim for. And we've made some market success, but there are a couple of other areas, quite frankly, we're failing in. And one of those is community engagement. And that's part of our mission as an institution. So we're gonna, I'll speak later to that. We're gonna take we are taking some real deep initiatives to build a bond with communities that we have not been successful, and it's our fault in getting, and them having access to our services. I think the part I'm proudest of is how our faculty have bought in to see that every student is successful at our institution, regardless of their background. And Wayne County is an interesting county, similar to Dr. Porter's circumstance. We have a really quickly growing Hispanic population. And in fact, it's represented in a larger presence on our campus than it is in our county. But our poverty has touched all races here in a very distinctive way. And so that has made equity even more important here. And so we're really concerned about social mobility and not just between group differences, but within group differences. We have a cadre of extremely successful Blacks here, but there seems to be a divide between that community and Goldsboro, a city, our county seat, is a city of about 36,000 people. And I think we have more federal housing developments per 1,000 people than any one city in the country. So there's a level of poverty there that is just distinct and has some of the ancillary issues that go along with it, of crime, and we aren't impacting those people like we should. And one thing I am convinced about is that the board, the executive team, and obviously you being an experienced president, you know how you approach your board is different than how you approach your executive team. So I've been a lot more hands-on within the last year around with the executive team of the college, understanding how important this is to this institution and the future of this county, but how it is important to me as their direct supervisor. So I would say I'm quite blessed in the people that I have worked with, yourself included, and Dr. Dukes, and at institutions that along the way were willing to invest in me. And so I've taken that lesson and really tried to invest in some of the people that I work with now to help them understand that I wouldn't be here without other people believing in me. So some of my own behavior has to be around believing in the people that I work with. And that professional development has been instrumental, Mary.
Well, thank you all for your comments around campus culture, and we're going to move on now to the next category, next theme that the president's asked. We asked a question, and I'm going to read this particular piece that actually was presented by one of your colleagues, and this was how it was given to me. It says, here, quote, "It seems that most times when I hear a presentation about equity, it begins with a personal story about how that individual has been affected by some social injustice or prejudice. It seems this validates their perspective and grants them some authority to speak on the subject. What if you have not experienced any social injustice or prejudice and did not have a personal story to serve as a foundation for your perspective or efforts on equity? How do you approach being seen as authentic without a personal story? Do you have to apologize to your white middle class for your white middle class upbringing?" So Tam, I'm going to give you this question. If you have never had lived the experiences, how do you appear authentic while doing the work? And how have you crafted your message?
Well, I would first start by saying and acknowledging that, yes, I have not lived many of the experiences that my colleagues, faculty and staff and students have lived. That's one thing that I have learned through the training that we've done and so forth. I've grown up, quite frankly, in a very privileged way compared to so many of my colleagues and students and so forth. And I share that with people. I know that my upbringing was much different than so many others around me. So that upfront honesty and acknowledgement of that is very important for me to share and for people to understand. I think the other thing that I try to practice and show and speak to, and don't always get it right, is the understanding that how important it is to develop empathy for those around you who've not lived in much the way I have. And I think it's easiest, it may easily be said by saying simply this: through developing an understanding of who an individual is, and really taking the time to get to know them and who they are and where they've come from, you do develop an appreciation for that. And when you develop an appreciation for who they truly are and what they bring to the table, there is a greater level of understanding and willingness to work together. So that's been my personal kind of motto, but also in speaking to the college and the campuses, acknowledging absolutely, I have not lived the experiences and will never know what that's like. And I also, you know, I can apologize for being white, but I am who I am. So I, you know, there's some things there that are out of my control, but what I do have control over and I try to express is the ability and the real desire to get to know somebody and what they bring to the table. And that's what I go back to as far as how we can work together to be a greater institution. If we can all embrace, which is a challenge daily, that kind of mentality, I think that's where I come from and what I hope I am able to demonstrate.
Charlene, do you want to make some comments over the message that was sent about, you know, how can I be authentic?
And I think that the single most piece of authenticity that I relate to is just being able to tell the truth. And I think it's what Tim has said, that no, it's not an experience that I've had, but it doesn't make me any less committed to ensuring that there is the kind of ideals in which we want to live and work at this institution and in this community. I think the other thing to understand is that we all bring biases to the table. Don't believe that because I am a woman of color that I don't have biases, because I do, you know, and I have had to learn to step back and not judge someone by where they grew up, how they grew up, by some innocuous statement that they made that I took offense to, but it wasn't intended to be offensive at all. So I think that it's really accepting people where they are and coming together to say, how do we work together for change? Absolutely, we all have a story, and your story can be that this is not the circumstance in which I grew up. However, what I have learned along the way, the education that I've been providing either through my own interest or because I've taken the opportunity to be in places and spaces to educate myself about these circumstances and then come back and say, how do we deal with this? How do we approach it? You know, what is it that we need to learn from our students or from other employees or from members of our community? You know, in Washington, D.C., I live in Maryland, and we call it the DMV. You know, I used to think it meant Department of Motor Vehicles, but of course it's D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. Believe me, in the county where I live, that is purported to be the most affluent African-American community in the nation, there are the haves and have-nots. As Thomas talked about, the community where he has the pleasure of serving, there are people who are making millions of dollars. And a mile away, there are folks who are living in such poverty that it will make you cry. So that I think it's knowing that you have your story, but you're willing to engage in the process so that that story of who you are doesn't have to condemn who you are.
Mark, I have a question for you on a little different plane. How do you build buy-in with faculty in that messaging and lead the work needed to build equity in teaching? What do you do when you encounter staff or faculty with strong opinions about equity as being overblown as an issue in the community college environment?
Give me the tough one. Well, I think first and foremost, I think I would say that kind of goes back to what Charlene just said, and I think Tony said earlier, and that is to let our faculty and staff see that I'm willing to also tackle the issues. Let them see that even though I'm a white male, I'm not afraid to roll up my sleeve and work alongside them to tackle the difficult issues around this topic. I think that's the first thing. The second thing that we've done is we've tried to set the expectation early. And that is maybe pretty simple, but we've revised our job description. And now our job descriptions for faculty and for our support areas include a component on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that sends a message to applicants as they're reviewing job descriptions and considering our institution as a place of employment, that equity is something that we value and that we support and that we expect at our institution. And then the other thing I would say for us, the thing that's most recently worked pretty well for us is letting the data kind of speak for itself. I mentioned earlier that we really doing some data analysis and getting a little bit more granular with our data. And just a couple of weeks ago when I met with our employees, which I think somebody mentioned this earlier too, I think it's good for them to hear from the president too about these issues and talking about the data. But I showed our employees some student success data or lack thereof for our most recent spring semester. And I'll share these numbers with you because I think it pretty much paints the picture of our institution and where we are currently. 63% of African Americans were successful in their courses this past spring. For white students, it was 77%. So a 14% gap in course success. 21% of African Americans withdrew compared to 13% of white students. And then we looked at fall to fall retention, and African Americans were retained at a rate of 33% versus 57% for white students. So a significant gap there in student success metrics that we have really got to do something about. But, you know, we really haven't gotten a lot of pushback In fact, from that meeting, I received several emails from our faculty saying thank you. Thank you for bringing this issue to our attention. You know, we never knew. We did have one issue and we were able to successfully kind of navigate it. And it was when we were revising our policies and procedures manual recently, and the issue of free speech zones came up at the same time that we as a society were dealing with all of the racial unrest and rioting and things of that nature. And so I had an employee ask me the question, you know, are we just promoting this issue and creating a problem potentially for our campus? And, you know, so we had a conversation. I had a conversation individually with that person. We worked through it, talked through it. And, but I think it is important as places of education that we provide venues where students feel safe to speak and to express themselves. But that's a challenge on a predominantly white campus that many of us face, and some issues that we really got some work to do with our faculty and staff. But so far, so good. We're going to keep on working through some of those challenges as we get there. But I think the data has spoken on our campus, and we'll let that kind of take us to the next steps.
Thomas, any follow-up comments on the conversation about messaging?
A couple of things to add, Mary, just listening to my colleagues and really learning a lot from them. And Kim's comment about, you know, maybe not having lived experiences. I can also share as a Black man that I've also had colleagues, Black colleagues, not in this profession, but who knew me when I was young, and my parents. And this conversation was just recent. And one of them said to me, well, you haven't had it hard because you're the son of Mr. and Mrs. Walker. And my parents were teachers, but that was by no means uncommon in North Carolina, which I think has the second largest number of HBCUs of any state, I think second only to Alabama. And so I grew up around a lot of educated and professional Blacks. But it also occurred to me that the man that said that to me used to be sitting in his house as a teenager, and I was outside cutting the grass. And it made me think that I'll never apologize for good decisions that I've made or people who have been in my life have made. So I think having the lived experience might give you a personal touch, but I don't think people should have to apologize for working hard and making the right decisions. And so I've had plenty of instances in my life where I felt like I've been the recipient of a racial snub or those sorts of things. And in one instance in my life, I think my life was at stake. But I've never brought those things up because I believe that all along, regardless of my gender, my skin color, I could outperform others on standard competencies, and that the content of my character was what mattered. And if that really comes across, I think, at least I've been told that by my faculty, staff, and students on this campus, that they know that I'm going to be genuine, and they know if they ask me a question, I may not say it the best way, but the answer will be true and authentic to the best of my knowledge. And I think that has made people really comfortable about talking with what in other venues might be sensitive topics, but there have been several instances that I've shared myself on the campus on a regular basis. And some of this is programmatic in nature, that people have built a level of comfort to be able to talk about these sorts of things. And not only just in a casual conversation, but in planning councils and in ways that are driving the strategic direction of the college. So those are my comments, Mayor.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you all the same question. We're going to finish up with this question, and then you can give us some of your personal reflections. And the question is, there are so many equity gaps in our programs that it feels as though we're trying to eat an elephant. How do we effectively undergird the academic success of first-generation students, low-income students, and our students of color during COVID-19, especially since many of these students were struggling before the pandemic? And how do we go about deciding on an area of focus? I'm going to ask each one of you to respond to that question and what area and your approach that you took to focus on these issues. Tim, you want to start?
Sure. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There are a lot of issues surrounding equity and inclusion and diversity and all these things. I think what we're trying to do, and we don't have it right completely, but we're trying to focus on what we say we're doing as our mission and our values and our purpose and our beliefs. And then we're trying to strategically build around that. And we do have, as I sit here and think, I'm writing so many notes about what we need to put in our strategic plan. I have to tap the brakes and say, this really is about making small but intentional steps. I mean, that's really the way you have to work. And we've had some conversations about this, but there are a lot of small wins, a lot of low-hanging fruit here that serve to do so much to move your institution forward. The acknowledgement, the conversations, and so forth. So, I think that's important. You've got to focus as best you can on what you think you have control over, and you do that through your vision and your mission, but also strategically, you plan for that, you accomplish it, and you move on and you build on it. And I think that's the only way you can turn this huge, huge, huge ship is piece by piece, effort by effort. That's my thoughts.
Mark, how about you?
Well, certainly the pandemic has exacerbated many of the challenges that our students face. I think that's certainly safe to say. Our minority students, our low income, our first gen students, even more so. And for us, we kind of took a holistic approach, I guess, to looking at this issue. And from my perspective, how can a student do well academically in the classroom if their basic needs haven't been taken care of? So we've been doing a lot of work around food insecurities, healthcare, clothing initiatives, things of that nature to kind of help our students with some basic needs. And the one thing to me that became abundantly clear throughout the pandemic is partnerships matter. And they matter more than anything during a time of crisis. And so we did a lot, and continuing to do a lot of work with community partners. One of the most innovative and successful things that we've done thus far is partner with a community health organization to put a health clinic on our campus. And that's been extremely successful. And so students are able to access general health care as well as mental health care right here on campus. And it's been through that partnership that we've been able to kind of keep students enrolled. One of the very unique things about it is the board for that organization voted, and they're actually waiving copay requirements for Pell recipients. So our lower income students can have free health care, free flu shots, free everything at our health clinic. And that's just been a tremendous success. We have athletics here on our campus, and we had pre-COVID, we had visitors here. And I know of several of our athletes, once their parents saw the health clinic, they said, this is where our son or daughter's going. And so it's had an impact on enrollment. It's had an impact on student success. But again, partnering with a community health agency to deliver that service. We do have a food insecurities effort going on campus in partnership with some of our food banks and other folks in our community that's been very successful. And the other thing the pandemic for all of us, I'm sure, made very, very clear, and that is the digital divide is real. And it's extremely real in rural North Carolina, and it's even more so with our low-income students. And so we had a pretty unique partnership with Google. We're fortunate enough to have them here in our community, and they really did 3 or 4 things that really supported student success. And one was they donated 75 Chromebooks that we were able to get in the hands of students pretty quickly back in March and April to help with their classes. They equipped school buses in our community with Wi-Fi, and they called them rolling hotspots, and they placed them in the most rural areas of our community so that students could have access to internet services. They funded a grant with us and put video conferencing classrooms in our traditional high schools. So now we're able to deliver college classes to each of our high schools via the information highway and make CCP opportunities available to some of those students who had travel barriers and couldn't come to campus and things of that nature. And so it's through those partnerships, Mary, that we've been able to do some things that I really think are going to, number one, they're keeping students enrolled. They're healthy. They're getting the food they need. I don't think I mentioned the Clothes Closet, but we have a partnership with a local group called the Clothes Closet, where students can receive clothing, and especially for interviews as they're preparing to exit, to represent themselves as they're preparing for jobs and things of that nature. But a true community effort. And I know all of our communities we serve are special, and without our community partners, we just couldn't do what we do.
Thomas, your thoughts on the question of institutional initiatives and dealing with the equity gaps, particularly with COVID?
Yes, Mary. Similar to Mark, we've taken a lot of initiatives around providing students with free laptops, Wi-Fi access points. We actually have a farmer's market adjacent to the college, which we partnered with them to provide free fresh vegetables and fruits every Monday and Friday, just adjacent to campus. And we actually have created some online cooking lessons. One of them about to be done by yours truly about healthier eating, because we do have, and as many rural communities do, and you worked in this state many years, you know our choices of culinary preferences is not always the healthiest. But I would also say one of the things during COVID we're going to be brave about and have already started is focusing in on where we saw a gap. We've been fortunate the last year. In fact, a month ago, we won a ACC Student Success Award, but we looked at that data, and a lot of our success has been around completion. So I'm going to air some dirty laundry real quick. Our white students are completing their degrees at 51%, at the 150%, the 3-year mark, which is more than half, more than double the national average. Our Hispanic students are at 57% and are the highest performing students on our campus, both in completion and in math. Our Black students are 17%, and we're ashamed of that. And we're not doing some things right. So one of the members of the executive team is about to expand her role and enjoying community engagement as a part of that. This past summer, we adopted 2 predominantly Black middle schools in Goldsboro, running summer academies for math and reading. But the plan is that my goal is, and we're working with the foundation already, to build up enough funds that we can run a self-sustaining summer academy for middle school and high school Black students, or at least we're identifying it by zip code, but that almost makes them all Black, that will work with them on math, science, and reading. Because some of our more selective programs, we're going to have to broaden the market of students who have the capabilities of doing that. And we've worked with the high schools, and what we found in Goldsboro in particular, and as a decades-long legacy of your really talented Black students getting out of town immediately after high school, never to return. And so we're going to broaden that base. All of this happens through partnerships. We're not doing it alone with Wayne County Public Schools, our foundation, the farmers market next door. But we're going to be bold and identify that group and say, okay, if we can have some measure of success with white and Hispanic students, then we should be able to manipulate ourselves and lead ourselves in a way that we can engage the Black community and have some success there. And it's not just transfer and completion. Some of the programs, as you well know, that really provide economic mobility are in your technical areas. And so we need to get more into our machinist program. We do have some success in welding, but what about our dental hygiene and our nursing programs and our mechatronics programs and our GM ASEP programs, where students come right out of that making really substantial, make more, relatively speaking, than I made coming out with a 4-year degree. And so we're really looking at our Black population and programs that provide them with economic mobility. And we're gonna focus and hone in on that and continue our success, but close that gap demonstrably between all of our other students and our Black students.
Thank you. Charlene?
You know, I think that they have actually said it all, Mary. I think that, you know, the cliche is, you know, how do you tackle an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. And that's what we heard here. And it's just been a pleasure for me to be on the panel with Mark and Tim and Thomas, and certainly with your moderation and leadership, because that's how we do this work. One day, one step at a time, always staying focused on it, and ensuring that those who we expect to be partners with us in this work maintains that same focus.
Thank you, but panel, and if we were all together, you'd get a big round of applause for your answers and your openness and your dedication. I think we have a little reaction here that we can put in, and we can show a little applause. So if you go to your reaction bar, you can put a little applause. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Charlene, so much. Very much appreciated. And I believe I'm going to hand this over to Kim.
Thanks, Mary. And my thanks also to everyone on the panel and to everyone attending today. I did want to draw your attention to the chat. I think there's one question in the chat about whether anyone has done a college survey on D&I. So if you have a response that you can offer, I invite you to do that. And I will now pass it to AJ. She was able to join us after the dissertation defense and would like to share a few words. And so AJ, welcome.
Well, I wish I would have been here for the full conversation, but anytime we can mint a new doctor, it's a great day. So there's a new doctor at NC State who she said, I think I'm gonna go have lunch. I said, that's how you're celebrating? And she said, well, I'm actually gonna have lunch with my family, which she said she hasn't done for the last several months, as she usually takes that time to write her dissertation. So I'm so sorry I missed the conversation, and want to extend my thanks as well to Mark, Tom, and Thomas, Tim, excuse me, for engaging with us and sharing your authentic stories, and echo and thank Charlene that doing it together in partnership is a critical component of this process, and we want to offer our support to you as an institution, as individual institutional leaders, and also through the system office to support equity work across the state. And want to highlight, you've been receiving communication from Kim regarding the Dallas Herring lecture, and also the different components of those lectures, and want to just remind you what those various components are. So 11 a.m. on November 10th is a smaller conversation for presidents only with Pam Ettinger. And it's an opportunity, if you cannot attend the 1 o'clock session, to have a further conversation. She will continue to talk about equity issues, but also strategies post-pandemic that she's seen across the country, and particularly in terms of partnerships. How do we tackle these issues together? So that's the 11 o'clock, 50-minute conversation. If you are able to attend the 1 o'clock, that's when she will provide her full lecture that she's been working on for probably 6 to 8 months now. So it's something she's been thinking about, of course, through her entire career, but we're excited to share with you. And then following that, we will have a panel of presidents responding. What are the key takeaways from that message? How have they addressed those takeaways at their own institution? And that includes William Serrata, Avis Proctor, and our very own Candy Diedemeyer, who will put some of what she said into context at their own institutions. And so we would love if you can attend everything, but we also know that that's very unlikely given what you're doing every day. So 11 o'clock for presidents only, 1 o'clock the larger lecture, and following that, the panel respondents. And again, thank you to Tim, Mark, Thomas, and Charlene for engaging us today. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you all.
There's also some resources that we will put in evaluation and also have online on the equity conversation. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and have a very wonderful Tuesday.
You do the same. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.